Thanks a lot, Danny. It's a pleasure to be back in Pennsylvania after a long time away, since I left in '95 when Governor Casey finished his second term. That was when I moved to Rome. So, the topic of the communication style of Pope Francis obviously is a huge topic, but I think I wanted to approach it sort of in a general way, trying to look at first the papacy, then the recent popes, and then Pope Francis, because the communication of a pope is not just the communication of any other person. It's a very unique institutional kind of communication. And one of the things that we're seeing, I think, in today's world is that the papacy has taken on sort of an interest for the entire spectrum of the world, not just the Catholic world, right? And in a way, it's a novelty, but it's also been something that we've seen growing, I think, ever since John Paul II. And if you go back a little further, it's quite surprising. If you think, a little further, quite a bit further, in the year 1800, all right, the last pope had just died in exile in France, kidnapped by Napoleon, in 1799. So that was the situation of the papacy at the beginning of the 1800s. Kidnapped by Napoleon, dead in France. End of the 1800s, after the removal of the Papal States by Garibaldi, you have the Pope as the prisoner of the Vatican, right? And with an Italian state surrounding the Vatican that is quite explicitly ideologically hostile to the Church, and the Pope, refusing to engage essentially with the world immediately around him. So, exile, prisoner of the Vatican, and then you have John Paul II at the end of the 20th century, who, at his death, is probably the first citizen of the world. I mean, everyone turned out for the funeral. An international love affair, really, that had taken place with John Paul II over a very long papacy that was transformative in many ways, and certainly in his style of communication, which I'll get into a little later. Now, I think some people would say that under Benedict that changed, but I don't think it did all that much. In other words, the papacy continued to occupy a very central place in the view of the world, and despite the completely different style of Pope Benedict from John Paul II, even when he traveled, his trips were quite successful trips. People tend to forget just how surprising, for instance, the very warm reception here in the United States was when he came here, his birthday party in the White House, all this, the good feeling around Benedict on his trips, again, quite surprising and counterintuitive. Especially there was a quite aggressive negative campaign against Benedict when he went to England, for instance. And yet the trip itself was a huge success. His speech in Westminster and all, and even the last great event, the World Youth Day in Madrid, which was a very successful trip. So despite appearances, I don't think that the papacy of Benedict changed things that much. And now clearly with Pope Francis, we're back kind of in more of the John Paul II environment, especially even the beginning of the papacy of John Paul II, where there's just an incredible enthusiasm and universal interest in what was then, I remember, a very young John Paul II, first non-Italian pope in all this in centuries, very dynamic. And so there's a growing interest in the Holy See, in the successor of Peter. You even see this in the media. Professor Arasa and I were just in Philly for the Religion News Writers annual convention. It's secular journalists who write about religious topics. And there were over 200 journalists there in the Lowe's Hotel to hear essentially a program, kind of a small version of what we do in Rome for one day program, waiting to hear about Pope Francis, gearing up for the trip. You even see in secular media, like the Boston Globe, and in the last couple of years has started this Crux website. They hired away John Allen, who is sort of the premier American Vaticanista, to come start a site dedicated to Catholic news within the Boston Globe. A secular newspaper basically creating a niche that is Catholic news. And hiring John Allen, but also hiring a young woman from Argentina, Inés San Martin, to be in Rome, permanently in Rome. So they have the Globe has a Rome correspondent, and John Allen, who lives in the United States and travels a lot, obviously, to Rome. Wall Street Journal, in the last year, also created essentially a Vatican correspondent. Frank Rocca, is a classmate of mine from college. I've known him all his life. Frank is the first Vaticanista of a secular paper from the United States. I mean, he's lived in Rome for many years, a great journalist. But the Wall Street Journal is dedicating, in an era when many newspapers are downsizing and all, the Vatican is on the map for the Wall Street Journal of all papers. That's part of I think the situation is there's a heightened attention to the Holy See, and then you have, I want to just very briefly talk about the different styles of John Paul II and Benedict and Francis. One way of looking at it, this is one of many ways to slice this pie. I think of them as actors on a stage. And in the case of John Paul II, you have an actor who seems to be born for the role that he's playing. He's on stage, he's aware that he's on stage, and he's comfortable being there. And he's comfortable talking from a position of authority to the multitude. It seemed to be made to talk to crowds. The large gestures, understanding the theatricality also of his position. In the case of Benedict, it's kind of the opposite. A person who's very uncomfortable on stage, acutely aware of being on stage, and didn't want to be there, and was ready to flee. Has a case of something of stage fright. And then the curious thing with Pope Francis is that he is, I think, not an actor. In other words, he's on the stage. But he doesn't seem to be aware that he's on the stage, and he acts as if he weren't. And yet, it's extremely effective as communication, as a way of engaging. He is tremendously effective. He seems to be at ease, to forget about himself. Whereas, as you could see, Pope Benedict, as a communicator, was thinking, what do I do? How do I behave in this situation? And Pope Francis seems to have none of those concerns. He seems to be completely free and unself-conscious, and not worried about what people might think, or is this appropriate for I'm the Pope, I shouldn't do that kind of thing. I don't know if people saw this. It's a famous video, at least in some circles, of Pope Francis one day in the Wednesday audience, driving around in the Pope Mobile, and you see it. You have to know what's happening. You wouldn't notice it unless you were told to look for it. But he's driving along and he's waving to people, and then all of a sudden, as he's waving, he goes, instantaneous, totally spontaneous, and took a fraction of a second to do it. But what he had seen in the crowd, someone with the flag of his soccer team, River, what is this? San Lorenzo in Buenos Aires, and they had won 3-0 the night before. a completely spontaneous reaction, and as I said, completely unconcerned about what people might think. Or Benedict, you can't imagine. He wouldn't know the soccer score, and he would never have done something like that. And I think John Paul probably wouldn't have done it either. But that tells you, I think, something about the ease or that at easeness of Pope Francis in front of the crowds. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the last two, about Benedict and Pope Francis, is that I think in both cases, this is maybe counterintuitive, we're dealing with types of humility, two different types of humility. One takes the form of essentially wanting to withdraw. I think Pope Benedict was probably, this is a hunch of mine, I have no inside knowledge of the Pope's mind, but as a theologian, I suspect that he was a little bit uncomfortable with the superstar papacy of John Paul. The whole sort of media hoopla around John Paul, it wasn't Benedict's style, and I think he didn't see it as entirely appropriate for the successor of St. Peter. And that's probably part of the reason why he didn't behave in the same way. It wasn't simply a question of his personality, though I think that's part of it. Right? He was personally disinclined, but I think also at a theological level, he was interested in downsizing a little the aura of the papacy. And I think also he would have been, as a professor, someone dedicated to the truth. He was really interested in getting people to focus not on himself as a person. Right? You got the sense with Benedict that he would have been perfectly happy to write, the encyclical or the message or the homily, give it to you in an envelope, and you take it home and you think about it and you absorb it and it'll do you good, right? He had no interest in actually engaging at a personal level. It was, here's the truth. You can forget about me, and I really think that is a kind of humility behind Benedict's style, and even the fact that he retired. I was talking with one of the papal biographers in Rome, a woman who knows him quite well, the correspondent of La Nación, one of the major papers in Buenos Aires, is Elisabetta Piquet, who one of her children was baptized by Cardinal Bergoglio, and she's intimate friend of the Pope's. But she wrote a book called Vida e Revolución, Life and Revolution, of Pope Francis. But she said, I remember talking with her one day, and she said, the most revolutionary thing that happened, this was last year, but the year before, wasn't anything that Francis did. The most revolutionary thing was Benedict. In the big picture, a pope resigning was incredibly revolutionary. It took incredible guts. And also, as I say, it's a kind of humility. The desire, he really did want to flee the stage, and in the end he did. He retired. Now, in the case of Pope Francis, you have something completely different in terms of communication. It's not the envelope, here it is, read it, the truth's there, don't bother about me. Right? And I don't want to give the impression that Francis is saying it is about him. It's not. And you don't get that sense with Pope Francis either. What you get the sense of with Pope Francis is it matters enormously to me, Jorge Bergoglio, right, that you understand this. And I am emotionally invested in your understanding this. With Benedict, you didn't get that sense. There was a certain kind of distance, neutrality, perhaps even shyness, in exposing what his own inner life. With Pope Francis, you see it on the surface. This is what I want. I want you to understand this, and he says it in that way. I mean, there's a famous audience with the Pope where he basically it was like a Protestant revival meeting with I can't hear you, and it was the living God is a merciful God, over and over. Dio vivente misericordioso, and he kept. Say it again, right? I want you to say it, and over, the crowd in the piazza shouting. I mean, as as different as you can possibly imagine from the style of Pope Benedict. In other words, there's an openness of the person, Jorge Bergoglio. He enters in play in the communication, right? And that's very effective as a style of communication. Evidently, it's much more engaging, right, than the professorial style of Pope Benedict. I think this accounts for a lot of the interest and the sort of immediate affection that people have for Pope Francis. Because a lot of it is clearly in the style, in the manner, right? The attraction that Pope Francis has is in some sense pre-ideological, so to speak. It's not when he was elected. Right, I was there. I was with ABC television, and got a cab ride home, and I talked with the cabbie. Always a good source, and I talked with the cabbie, and said, "Were you there? Right? Did you see when the Pope, the Habemus Papam moment when the Pope came out and all?" And he said, "No, I wasn't, but I was working. But I was on the phone with my wife, who was at home watching on television, and she was in tears." And what's interesting about that is that, one, people weren't expecting Cardinal Bergoglio to be elected. He wasn't one of the top, candidates. Most people knew next to nothing about Cardinal Bergoglio, and yet he was immediately embraced, especially in Italy, with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to what people would have known about the man. In other words, there seemed to be a hunger for something that was satisfied on the spot. And you think, well, how could that be? Because it can't. They didn't. It's not that he said "buonasera." He said "good night." That's not going to do it. That's certainly not in Italy. It's the most banal thing that you could say at that time of the evening. And yet, as I say, it's a pre-ideological. It's not necessarily about the content. It's about the style, the manner, the sense of the person, right? That is so attractive. Now later, obviously there's a lot more, but at the beginning there was an immediate connection, and it had to do, I think, with the ease with which people sensed they could relate with him. Right? He seemed perhaps the father figure that people might have been looking for in a pope, that was somewhat missing since the latter part of John Paul II's papacy. The persona was perhaps hidden by the mask of his age and suffering, and he was unable to engage as much as he had when he was younger. Benedict was disinclined to engage. He came across as a teacher more than a dad. But Pope Francis was dad. You could easily imagine him as your own kind of father. Now, this ease of communication, you could say naturalness of Pope Francis, or even I would say, perhaps it's a loaded word, but the democratization of communication is a novelty, I would say, but it's also a really part of a continuum, if you think about it, that Pope Francis seems to speak in a way that's less hierarchical. His pronouncements often less in a sacred or solemn tone. But this already began with John Paul II. In other words, one of the striking things about these last three popes simply is the abundance of communication compared to what Paul VI and previous popes were doing in terms of communication. It's night and day. I mean, it's an explosion of media attention and communication in all means: radio, television, trips. All the trips. We were talking about communication constitutes reality. Well, the papal trips are a huge part of that. I mean, they create a reality that is about the identity of the Pope. It's about the identity of the Church, the universal Catholic Church. It transforms the place where the Pope goes. Those are enormous communication events, quite apart from anything that's actually said, Just the mere fact of the Pope's presence communicates a great deal about who he is and what the Church is. And that begins with John Paul II and continued, perhaps despite his natural inclinations, under Benedict. And it hasn't stopped, even though Cardinal Bergoglio said he didn't like to travel. He always insisted that he was a homebody. And in fact, he doesn't go on vacations. He's sitting in Santa Marta right now, listening to the radio or the television, or not the television, he doesn't watch television. Music and a book. That's his idea of vacation. He's not a natural traveler, but he's doing it because I think the experience of the first trip, the one in Brazil, convinced him that this was part of his job. This was needed, it was good, and he's going to keep doing it. So he's become a traveler too, as well as I think Benedict had to become a traveler. So there's the trips. This is I'm saying about the sort of democratization of the papal communication style. A major event in this, people may forget about it, is John Paul II's interview book with Vittorio Messori. An interview book of a sitting pope, right? And then the Pope went on to write some books that were, his own books as Pope. They weren't encyclicals, they weren't papal documents, right? He wrote a book about his priestly ministry, gift and mystery, and things like that. But the first sort of crack was an interview book. It was a huge breakthrough in sort of communications for the papacy. And then Benedict did the same thing. Benedict, and not only that, but then he wrote books as a theologian. The 3 books of Jesus of Nazareth volumes. It's quite a striking thing where a pope is writing a book saying, I'm writing this as Joseph Ratzinger and not as Benedict. Right? And this is very interesting about sort of downsizing, I'd say, the figure of the Pope. Like anything that comes out of the Pope's mouth is somehow enormously a papal pronouncement. But we've been getting away from that. We've been getting away from that for quite a while. I think it begins with John Paul II. It continues with Benedict. And now, certainly another part of this would be the plain interviews. Again, begins with John Paul II, continues with Benedict, and now Pope Francis, who's even less scripted in his interviews. So the interviews with Benedict were prepared. I mean, he had the questions, and it wasn't a completely spontaneous situation. With Pope Francis, it is. But then you have beyond that. We're getting beyond that. We're getting into papal phone calls, papal emails, and things. And the Pope is leaving it unclear, essentially, and frequently, whether he actually said the things that are reported. In other words, they're not even bothering to deny. So someone says, the Pope called me and he said this. And everyone's, oh, he said that? Really? And then, well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. And Father Lombardi doesn't get up and, oh, no, that's absolutely not true what the Pope actually said, and as if it needed to be clarified. We're not dealing with that anymore. Maybe he said that, maybe he didn't. There's these famous interviews that the Pope has done with this Italian journalist Scalfari, who's 90 years old and doesn't take notes, right? And he did these interviews without consulting anyone. In other words, the Pope is basically in charge of his own communications. That's another interesting thing about this papacy, is that and he sat down for 2 interviews, even after the first one, which was roundly criticized and caused a lot of trouble. He did it again, right? The Pope really, it seems to be saying, listen, don't take everything so seriously. And we don't know if the things that Scalfari said were actually said by the Pope. And Scalfari even admits that it's kind of my impressions of what the Pope said. Whatever. Okay. One of the ironies of the situation in which we find ourselves is that Pope Benedict did have difficulties with communications, and partly, as I say, because of his style, and partly because some of the things that happened in terms of the sex abuse crisis, at least the revelation of what had happened. A lot of that was coming out during his papacy, and also the crisis with the butler and all these various things that went haywire and during the papacy, coupled with his, as I say, disinclination to engage in sort of media relations, caused the Vatican to hire a specialist, Greg Burke, who went to Columbia University, Columbia School of Journalism, wrote for Time magazine, has been in Rome. He's an Italian citizen now, was Fox News' television correspondent, and someone who's enormous experience, professional experience in the sector, was brought aboard and into the Secretary of State to help strategize about communications. And basically within a year, the Pope resigned. And then you have Pope Francis come aboard, and essentially the problem that Burke was hired to deal with was gone. And he said that, what is the strategy? So get out of the way. It's not, it doesn't have to do anything now. The Pope can't buy a negative, so at least back then. I mean, it's a little more complicated now. It'd be difficult for him to get negative press attention. So, I think there's a very interesting situation. So there's an abundance of papal communication, of statements, some of them in contexts that would have been unthinkable in the past. But their value as papal pronouncements is becoming less and less. In other words, there's been so much, right, that it's not clear what value has to be placed on any given statement. We're in an era of transformation, I think, on that point. Pope is also interesting in that there's a large difference between his writing and his speaking. I don't know if people have noticed this. Well, I shouldn't say speaking, because his daily homilies are quite short and punchy, and in his recommendations in Evangelii Gaudium, right? There's a large section about how to do a homily, and it's all about brevity, and yet when he writes, the Evangelii Gaudium itself is extremely long, as is Laudato Si, the encyclical. They're both very verbose documents. So what exactly the writing style of the Pope, as opposed to his homiletic style, are quite different. I'm not sure whether that means that. Obviously, everyone knows the Pope doesn't write everything. My tendency would be to sort of put the blame on that the fact that when he's preaching in those daily homilies, it's him, right? What he writes in an encyclical Evangelii Gaudium is many hands, right? And of course, he goes over it and writes some of it, etc. But it's a different style of communication, and less immediately traceable to the mind of Jorge Bergoglio. Last point, perhaps, is more interesting probably to have questions. And I also wanted to say that I'd be happy to talk about the reform of the Curia. I realize we're in a business school, and questions of management and those things are probably of great interest here. So that wasn't part of the communication style per se, but I'd be happy to talk about that. Last point is the one-on-one style of communications of the Pope. One of the things that is a kind of a consequence of the fact that he's on stage, seems comfortable, but doesn't seem to feel as if he's on stage. He looks as if he's not on stage, is the fact that he always speaks, or almost always, in a kind of, as if he was talking to one person. Now, this has a couple of consequences. One is, it was pointed out by one of the interviewers of the Pope, Father Spadaro in Civiltà Cattolica, that if you look at the photos of the Pope, like he's in an audience or something, he's never looking at the crowd. It's never, looking at everybody. Whereas with John Paul II, he did have that. There was I'm here, and everyone's out there, and Francis is always looking at somebody. There's always this, and of course, modern photography is ideal for picking this up. Probably you wouldn't have noticed it, a century ago, that the Pope was actually looking at someone. But that's actually, if you look through the photos, Pope Francis is talking to people, individual people, frequently. And I think, and he said it himself, he said it in that interview, he's not used to masses, to large crowds. One of the things that's a more interesting, I think, consequence of this. Second consequence is that it affects the way he does interviews. He never did interviews as cardinal. One of the striking things about Cardinal Bergoglio is a complete absence of interviews. He's changed, completely his style of interaction with the media. In Buenos Aires, it was impossible, I've talked to lots of reporters, to get an interview with Cardinal Bergoglio. He did written interviews that I think were probably done by, someone else in the office of the bishop who answered those written interviews. But he was nothing like he is now. But when you see him on the plane doing those interviews, I think it's instructive. Think as if this was a private meeting between him and the person who's asking the question. And I think it will shed light on the way he talks. And also on the content. In other words, he speaks, and this causes a certain amount of, sometimes, controversy. And some of the controversies around the statements of the Pope, I think, are due to this. In other words, he speaks as, say, I might speak if I were sitting alone with someone over lunch and we started talking about, the affairs of the church. Well, I would say things in a way, in a certain casualness, and perhaps also thinking more about how this person is going to understand it. In other words, if this person is not a believer, I'm going to say it in a little different way, and I'm going to use language that he'll understand. I mean, for instance, the thing about something very specific, the question of breeding like rabbits line. The Pope, someone has asked how many kids. It's not as if Catholics have to breed like rabbits, which is the language of secular criticism of the Catholic Church's teaching in Humanae Vitae, right? And to hear it coming from the Pope, say, oh my gosh, But of course, he's talking with a secular journalist, right? And he's sort of entering into how they're thinking, right? And I think that happens almost constantly when we're in one-on-one conversations. You're always modifying what you're saying to the person you're saying it to. Now, when you're Pope, and that comes out as sort of the official announcement, this is the Pope of the Catholic Church. It can be easily taken as a sort of a statement of general principle, and that's how people are. That's why I think people are nervous about some of the things that the Pope says. But I think it really helps to think of that as part of his one-on-one style, and as I say, it's very, very present in the interviews. Even this thing with Scalfari, he's not thinking in terms of the journalist, the 90-year-old journalist who doesn't take notes, right? He's dealing with him on a one-on-one basis. He's an atheist, right? And I imagine that the Pope is doing sort of a personal apostolate with this journalist. That's how he sees it, right? And he's interested in what good can I do for this journalist in that case, which is edifying but somewhat problematic from the point of view of governance, right? Because you can obviously, if you're talking to different people, you're going to send different messages, right? And if everything is understood as a statement of government, then you're going to cause confusion. There's a trade-off there, right? And one of the solutions, as I say, is kind of lowering the level of the value level that's given to a given papal statement. Saying he can say a lot of different things. Don't take it all as a statement of general principle, etc. However, he is the Pope, and it's going to be hard. I think, to manage that because there's an enormous attention, not just from Catholics. One of the interesting things about the situation we're in now is that he has the faithful who, in a certain sense, are hanging on his words because they have to, they believe they ought to. But now the non-believers have tuned in to hear what Francis is saying, because he seems to be saying things that are new and different and interesting. Not to the faithful, but to people of all faiths. So that's an enormous opportunity and a very interesting situation to find oneself in as the Pope at the beginning of the 21st century. But it's a risky situation. I think I'll leave it at that. And I say, any questions you might have, fire away.
How big a risk do you think he has coming to the U.S.? When you talk about his style,
yeah,
talking to an individual, my understanding is he's talk to Congress, you talk to the UN, you've got different constituencies here. He's touched on things in the past. He's touched on environment, income inequality, terrorism. And when you look
It's not like he's coming from a complicated situation in Cuba either before the...
and when you look at, our media here,
Yeah.
they look at the same thing in different ways, right?
Um,
Depending on which outlet you're looking at.
One of the obviously there is a certain risk, but I think he also has just enormous goodwill on his side, coming from the media itself, right? And that's been a very positive thing. I think the media appreciates the ease with which he talks to them, and they're willing not to make mountains out of molehills. Sometimes they make mountains out of molehills that they prefer. Perhaps there's some journalists who sort of emphasize things that they think they wish the Pope had said, and they leave out things that the Pope also said that might have modified that. I mean, there's a certain bias sometimes, obviously, in the media, but I don't think he runs a great risk. I think that the trip to the United States is going to be a huge success. And on the other hand, the Pope has surprised everyone, and he may say things in those, whether it's Congress or at the UN, that will take people aback. One of the things that I think it's important to, I've lived outside of the U.S. now for 20 years, and I think, and I live with many people I've lived with many people from Latin America, and I spent a few months in Buenos Aires as well, and is the way the United States is perceived from the outside is very different from the way we see it. And so we're acutely aware of political, cultural differences here. We divide up the country in different slices and ideologies and whatnot. But from the outside, the U.S. is one big monster, especially from Latin America, and it's the capitalist empire, it's military power, it's and I joke, from the South to a large extent. I was exaggerating a little bit, but George Bush and Hillary Clinton are both gringos. That's how it is, and there's a certain truth to that. Obviously, we recognize enormous differences between them, and those differences are true, right? But also, there's a certain continuity in the big scheme of things, the way the U.S. behaves and the international scene, and its general influence in the rest of the world, the culture that we export, right? And I think sometimes we think we're ashamed of the things that the U.S. exports, right? And our tendency from the inside is to say, well, it's not coming from me; it's coming from so and so. That could be the right or the left. I mean, right? We don't want to say that's the U.S., but from the outside, well, sorry, it is. That's the U.S. That's what the U.S. gives the rest of the world. And I suspect that we're gonna get a sense of that when the Pope speaks, because he's coming from Buenos Aires. From Argentina, in particular, there's an edge, especially the Peronist side of Argentinian politics, which he kind of comes from, doesn't look at the United States in a friendly way. And I suspect that there'll be a bit of an edge to what the Pope has to say, but the funny thing is, it will probably cut both ways in terms of the internal politics of the United States. He might talking. He made some comments in Philippines about gender theory and ideological imperialism, right? But also there's the stuff about consumerism and or immigration. Or it's going to be probably going to step on a bunch of toes. I think that's my.
One of the things from a communication style that I've noticed is he constantly refers to himself as the Bishop of Rome, and I guess I'm curious your thoughts on the effect of his style on the rest of his brother bishops around the world, and either the pressure that they feel one way or another or maybe the freedom that they feel as a result of his style and the way that he approaches it.
That's a very complicated sort of dynamic, because it's true the Pope has spoken of himself as the Bishop of Rome and kind of laid emphasis on that and talked about collegiality and synodality. At the same time, I think at the, I can't say grassroots level, episcopal level, right? There are probably quite a few bishops who say that that's actually not how he's functioning as Pope. In other words, he probably functions as Pope a little bit more like the Jesuit provincial that he once was. In other words, consulting and making decisions on his own. Even some of the things like the phone calls and stuff that, if you're the bishop in the diocese where the Pope makes a phone call to some person, you're put in a hot, that from an episcopal collegiality point of view, that's a little hard to handle, right? What do I do? I say, the Pope's wrong, or if he doesn't know all the information, he doesn't know the whole story. I mean, if you were a bishop here, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't call, Shep wouldn't be, making private phone calls, responding to the problems in other dioceses, So in that sense, he's not actually acting like the Bishop of Rome. He's acting like the Pope, the pastor of the world, really. Which is, I think it's John Allen, I think, who said that, and I think there's a lot to that. And it cuts both ways. There might be some problems with it, but I think there's an enormous positive side in that, and that people see in him essentially the kind of pastor of the parish that they would like to have. And of course, with the modern communications and stuff, it's now possible basically to relate to the Pope more than you relate to your pastor. Right? You're listening to the homily that morning in Santa Marta. You can hear it. You can in Italian, but if you know Italian, you get the Pope's preaching to you every morning, right? And you like him, you see him, you have his picture, and you don't have a picture of the local pastor on your wall, right? And so, as I say, the global village effect of the modern communications makes it possible for the Pope to essentially, function as the local pastor for the world. Very interesting. Sarah Vaughan.
Thank you, Bob. Sarah Vaughan, Brigham Philosophy Department. I'd love to get your comments on two issues that you didn't speak to, but I think you have probably a lot to say. The first is, as part of communication is also aesthetics, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how his aesthetic and his presentation
Totally.
makes him such a radical new presence.
Right.
And I'm thinking here of things like how you talked about the immediacy of the cab driver's wife, but how his immediate eschewing of the gold and silver for
Right.
stainless steel, and save your money, don't come to the canonization,
Right, yeah.
give to the poor.
The Ford Focus.
That the aesthetics of who he is and how he carries himself. And then related to that, but a second point, was I was thinking, I'd love to hear your comments on this and see if you think there's anything to this difference or if I'm overdrawing it. But I was thinking about content in communication. So we talked about how communication isn't just reflective of reality, but
Constitutes it.
and shapes reality. I'm thinking that in the outside of in the secular world, John Paul II was very likable, but John Paul II and Benedict seemed very tied to the moral teachings of the Church,
Right.
in the nature of the encyclicals and Ratzinger's whole history, whereas Pope Francis is focusing on the social justice teachings and Catholic social thought, which has always been our purchase with the secular world, where we connect on the public square.
Right, yeah.
What people like
Right,
about
exactly.
Catholics. So I was wondering what you thought about both of those.
Oh, those are great questions. The first one about aesthetics, that falls, I think, into the category of things that actually are part of a continuum. In other words, more or less continuum. The real break is John Paul II. It was John Paul II who shed a lot of the trappings of the papacy. Some of the most surprising things, and people were very much ready for it. Right, but people, I think we forget now. We're accustomed. Many of you perhaps weren't even born, right? When Jean Paul came to the papacy, to Rome, but his style was so different from the previous popes, including the clothing and the whole style, his use of I. He talked, and there's the personal pronoun. I mean, the manner of John Paul II was, I think, the sharpest break. What we've seen since then has been, more or less a continuum. Benedict became a slightly more, you would say, traditional papal, in the fancier vestments, etc., but not much more. We're still in a very modern sort of phase of the papacy, and the novelty of Pope Francis, say, not living in the papal apartments, driving around in the Ford Focus, the shoes, the handbag, what is his carrying his luggage on the plane, those kinds of things, I think are actually relatively small changes compared to what happened under John Paul II. I think that was the big break. But those are forms of communication. I mean, in other words, the gestural communication, the way of life, the example that he's setting, and it has consequences. There's no question, that I know, the people working in the Vatican, in the Curia, think twice now about if anyone's going to buy a car, they're going to think about it. They are. I swear, everyone in the Vatican is thinking, that's going to look bad. It's going to look like I have a nicer car than the Pope. I can't, it's gotta. How does that work, And the clothing and all the whole. The example of poverty of the Pope, and the funny thing is, and he himself has said it, Pope Francis has said it, it's not as if John Paul II or Benedict were living lives of luxury. And in fact, the papal apartments are nothing to brag about. The building is impressive and all, but if you've ever been up there or seen the pictures inside the papal apartments, it's nothing. And it's exactly the same level, I would say, as Santa Marta. In fact, Santa Marta is more modern, actually. It's not really, and the Pope said it wasn't about luxury. It was about the fact that there were more people around, and he didn't want to be isolated in the papal apartments. Complicated, but I think more or less that's true. But it doesn't really matter in terms of the communication, because it's been interpreted as a renunciation of the papal lifestyle. The not living in the papal apartments has taken on a meaning that the Pope himself has denied that it has, and it's a good meaning. And in any case, it's a positive message about simplicity of life, etc. Now, so essentially, the aesthetics is part and parcel of the communication of the Pope, and very important. Now, the question about his sort of stress on social issues as opposed to the moral issues, as a point of engagement with the secular culture, I see that in the context of a much broader. This is another lecture but it's important. Is his message of mercy? In other words, he talks about mercy all the time. John Allen says, if you have to have a one-word interpretive key of this papacy, the word is mercy. It's in his motto. The motto of the Pope is miserando atque eligendo, having mercy and choosing, and it's about the calling of St. Matthew by Christ. So there's no question that mercy is at the center of this, of his own self-understanding. And I think the emphasis that he's laying on mercy, I don't think it's a strategic decision to look for the common ground and avoid the contentious grounds of moral sexual politics and things. I think that, and I've reasons to say this beyond just a hunch, that his decision reflects an analysis of the situation where we are today in the world, that the real problems of the faith in the 21st century, if you had to pick one, right, what would you say it is? Is it going to be moral issue X, stop that and everything's going to be solved? No, it doesn't work that way, right? And abortion, that's not where the whole game is played. And the real problem facing the world today is basically people don't understand who God is, whether there is a God, who that God is, and who am I in relation to that God. I mean, we're at a much lower level than issue X, issue Y, fix that, and everything's, And the Pope, and this is where I say there's good evidence for this, is that he when he was given the book of Cardinal Casper called Mercy, right? Title of the book, the Pope's when first seeing the cover of the book, Casper tells the story. The Pope took the book and said, the name of our God. Looking at the word mercy as the name of God. And so it really is about his focus on mercy, I think, is a way of saying what we have to straighten out first is a theological identity question. Who is God? Once you've answered who is God, and if you understand God as mercy, then all those moral questions can be addressed in a different light. In other words, they're understood not as an imposition, but as a consequence of God's mercy. In other words, God loves you and wants you to be happy. And the laws, those moral laws, are part of the mercy. There are ways to get to God and ways to get to your own happiness. They're not a series of rules that are somehow, exceptions to the mercy of God, right? This is God's justice or the rule-making God, and then there's the God of mercy over here. You have to understand God is mercy. And when Jesus says, for instance, the woman caught in adultery, go and sin no more, actually that's the voice of mercy. That go and sin no more that's how mercy sounds. Because he loves that woman so much, he's telling her how to be happy. Because sin is not going to make you happy. And so I think, but you have to understand who you're talking to. In this case, who Jesus is, but who God is, and then the laws can make some sense. Otherwise, you're never going to get anywhere. Just telling people stop that, don't do that. It's obviously some people will understand, the arguments of natural law and law. You can make a good argument, I think, reasonable arguments for the moral law of the Church. But and I think those arguments should be made. However, I think the overall picture of who God is, who am I in relation to God, is the one that the Pope wants to set, and he wants to focus on that. And then you have a better chance of getting people to listen on the moral questions.
You alluded to the fact earlier that the Pope, for an encyclical, for instance, will depend on some writers.
Right, sure. Normal. I was a speechwriter.
Yeah.
No crime.
A parallel that we have here in the United States, it's a good one. Cardinal Bernardin, he probably talked to Brian Hare 2 or 3 times a week.
I remember Brian Hare,
And that whole consistent life ethic, that seamless garment metaphor, which tied everything together. The Pope is going to be bringing a couple of texts with him.
Right.
Because he's speaking at the United Nations, you don't go in there with just
winging it.
He's going to speak before the U.S. Congress. So my question is, who do you suspect might be someone who is giving them a paragraph or 2 in preparation for those talks?
Well, my own experience writing speeches is any indication. Those kinds of speeches, say speech to Congress or the UN, are probably going to be divvied up. And different specialists will handle different parts of it. So justice and peace obviously will have. I would imagine will have a hand. There is the different pontifical councils, right? Will have specialists, right? People say that Cardinal Turkson wrote a good deal of Laudato Si and things like he's head of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. Now, the truth is, I suspect it actually wasn't Cardinal Turkson, but his second, who's an American, who probably wrote a large part of that. The Pope seems to rely a great deal on Victor Fernandez, who's the president of the Catholic University of Buenos Aires, who he made a bishop like the day after he was elected Pope. so clearly a favorite intellectual of the Pope, Victor Fernandez. Within the Vatican, I don't know of, and this is a bit of a mystery actually, who exactly the Pope turns to. As I say, the Victor Fernandez is in Buenos Aires, right, and they're in close contact. But within the Vatican, I don't think, certainly, or not. One of the interesting things about the Pope is he hasn't changed many of the dicasteries in the Curia. Many, if not most, are headed by the same people who were there when Benedict was Pope. People talk about the reform of the Curia and all, but actually, what's most remarkable is the stasis. I mean, the lack of change in the personnel. Just this morning, I was at the cathedral, and we were driving out of the parking lot. We saw Father Guido Marini, Monsignor Marini, who's the head of ceremonies, the papal liturgical ceremonies, talking with Father Dennis Gill of the cathedral, and they're organizing clearly, the papal ceremonies here in Rome. And we spotted the Guido Marini, but Guido Marini is totally associated with Pope Benedict and the liturgical style of Pope Benedict, and yet he's still there. And that's true on a number of in a number of the dicasteries. There's a striking lack of revolution in that sense. But getting back to the question, though, I don't know of any. I couldn't put my finger on anyone particular in the Curia who is like a privileged the writer for the Pope. My suspicion is, as I say, the Turkson, perhaps with Laudato Si. Evangelii Gaudium, I think, is actually mostly, this sounds bad, but cobbled together, from previous writings. In other words, a lot of Evangelii Gaudium, it's natural enough. You arrive and you have to publish something. You draw on stuff you've already written, right? And I think a lot of that is taken from things that the Pope already said in one place or another, and probably those were written not hidden physically, but probably in collaboration with Victor Fernandez in Buenos Aires.
I'm sorry
That's
about
it.
the job.
It's late, sorry.
We have a 12:30 commitment, and I'd like to make sure they get a chance to eat. So you'll hang around for answering more
Sure,
questions on a one-on-one
absolutely.
basis as the Pope would?
Sure.